community relations consultant. And these guys really liked Ira. Some of them would even end up defending him in court later on as character witnesses for his murder trial. And he wasn't even getting paid for this work. He passed it off as just a friend doing his civil duty, but I am sure that he always allowed them to pay for lunch at his favorite French restaurant, La Therese, which is where he always held these meetings. But all that is neither here nor there. We know this guy is a grifter. That's not new news. Now let's move along, because by the fall of 1972, Ira would meet the enigmatic and aloof Polly Maddox while she was having breakfast at La Therese. And if Iris to be believed, she was then moving into his place about 10 days later. Now, by this point, Ira had moved out of the piles and was living in this tiny little apartment at 3411 Race Street. Listen, I don't want to make a huge deal of this because
Hear that? You hear that? You folks hear that? Ira moved out of the piles and was living at 3411 Ray Street. I've actually looked this place up on Google Maps.
it's probably
Now listen to this.
right around the
This
time that Einhorn
Einhorn
moved out
moved
of the
out.
piles, there was a woman who
Einhorn
was found dead
dead.
in the basement of one of those buildings. Was never really determined about it. As far as I could tell, that case was never really resolved. And I'm not saying that Ira had anything to do with that, but I've had zero dead bodies turn up at places that I've lived. And in his lifetime, Ira had two. So I'm just saying. Regardless, Holly took up with Ira, and the relationship was strained from the start. They thought Holly would move out, Holly would come back, they'd be attached at the hip, they'd fight again, Holly would leave again, Holly would come back again. Holly, like so many other women, had been taken in by Ira's baby blues and his uncanny ability to make every woman feel like she was the only woman. Because make no mistake, Mr. Women's Liberation, Peace and Love, Mama's Boy Einhorn was a full on womanizer. Even for the time, he had a bad reputation in regards to women. They were collected up and tossed out easily. He never considered one his equal, and he tended to bully them, sometimes even getting violent. Many of his male acquaintances considered him quite manipulative when it came to getting companionship. Of course, all the while, pushing the talk of feminism, women's issues. These guys are all like that, right? We all know some version of this guy. Feminist in the streets, patriarch in the sheets. And Holly, she had a bit of a self-esteem issue. So getting love and attention from great Ira Einhorn always seemed to have important and influential people surrounding him. Well, she was just glad to be in his orbit most of the time. And this is by no means her fault. Guys like Einhorn can sniff out insecurity like a bloodhound. They manipulate and twist women around until they don't know which way is up. So I don't want anybody thinking that Holly's involvement with Ira was in any way a moral failing on her part. She was caught in a tractor beam that she could not escape from. And Ira knew that. He did that with everybody. He was a malignant narcissist. So, from your perspective right now, everything just suddenly is different, and I'm wearing different clothes. And the lighting is different. The obvious explanation for this, which you probably already guessed, is that I had to stop filming. It was getting very late. I was getting very tired. And in the room that I'm filming in, because I can't have any fans on or anything, it was ungodly hot. So I had to stop, and now I'm back again. So let's pick right up where we were. Molly constantly undervalued herself, while at the Holly constantly undervalued herself, while at the same time maintaining a fierce independent spirit. And a common squabble between the couple involved the fact that Ira felt like he should not have to be tied down to just Holly. Sexually speaking, he wanted to sleep around. Basically, theoretically, Holly was free to do the same, but that was really truly only theoretical because Ira had proved himself to be quite controlling and jealous. He even admitted that he had
After that,
nightmares
quite
about Holly
controlling, got
sleeping
that
with other men.
quite
He
quite
had no
control.
qualms
Was quite
about
controlling.
being with women other than Holly, however. Usually, when they would get into these arguments, Holly didn't want to deal with it, so she would just take off. Now, Ira always maintained kind of a cool, laid back appearance. Kind of like she was free to do whatever she wanted, and he didn't really care. But the fact is, he cared very deeply. When she was gone, he pined for her. He would beg her to, and ultimately always did. Now, obviously, I can't know for sure. I didn't know either of these people personally, but I feel like it's possible that Holly, having spent most of her life kind of aimless and adrift, really wanted somebody to latch on to, somebody to adore. And in many ways, she did adore Ira. She did think of him as being intellectually superior to her. My personal opinion, Ira was more like a spoiled child than a partner. I mean, at this time, he was 32 years old and he was still sending his laundry to be done and delivered back to him by his mother. At the same time, he was incredibly self assured, which Holly was not. And he probably had the right mix of both needy and demanding to make Lee feel both beholden to him and responsible for him. What I see is kind of a parent to child relationship wherein Holly is the parent and Ira is the demanding, vigilant child. But I think that Holly probably saw Ira in some ways as a type of father figure. He was considerably older than her, and all of that is just conjecture. Point is, I think that there were some things about Ira that drew Holly to him, but his domineering attitude and his insistence on always doing things his own way really clashed with this idea of the independent woman he wanted to be. Ira probably just wanted somebody to be at his beck and call, wanted somebody who he saw as being inferior to him, which was almost everyone, and wanted to serve him. And Holly, for the most part, seemed to be willing to fill this role. And it wasn't all bad. Holly seemed to get along really well with Ira's parents, especially B. Einhorn, who, despite the fact that Holly was not Jewish, seemed to really like her too. Maybe Holly's time learning about Jewish culture while living in Israel had endeared her to the older woman, who often helped her perfect her repertoire of traditional Jewish comfort foods. However, friends of the couple were beginning to get a little bit concerned about the waif-like Holly, and they felt that Ira's domineering and combative attitude was doing some really serious damage to this poor girl and to their relationship. He would frequently yell at her and belittle her in front of other people. And when Holly came to him with some complaints about being dissatisfied in the bedroom, he wasted no time to make sure she understood that that was her hang up. It was her fault that things weren't good in that area. He had no problem shaming her and making her feel really less than. He also frequently withheld any kind of emotional support. He would just be totally cold to her, and it was becoming very clear that her mental health was suffering. Perhaps Ira's worst offense was when she took him back to Texas to meet her family. They found him to be smelly, brutish, badly mannered, and worst of all, they did not like the way that he treated their daughter. As badly as he treated her at home, he treated her the same way, right in front of her parents. Her mother Liz said of this occasion, He had her so convinced that she was nothing. She was just stupid, and she really didn't have sense enough to go around the block unless he was nice enough to lead the way. He didn't even bother to hide how controlling and disrespectful he was to Holly in front of her father. Shortly after the trip to Texas, Einhorn was invited to co-author a book about UFOs with Ralph and Judy Bloom. Holly was going to come along on this excursion. The couple had rented a cabin in a remote part of New Jersey so that the whole foursome could go and stay there and have peace and quiet while they completely dedicated themselves to working on this book. Ralph Bloom said that Holly hardly spoke the whole time. He wasn't really even sure why she was there. She did not have the same academic background to work on the stuff. She wasn't helping them with a book at all. And she really didn't talk to anybody. He said she mostly sort of was doing domestic tasks like cleaning and cooking. And all the while, Ira was just berating her and bullying her and making her cry. So in this cabin, there were two bedrooms, and then the bedrooms shared a bathroom. So you could go into the shared bathroom from either side.
Hear that,
He
guys?
said that when you were in that bathroom, you could clearly hear what was going on in the other room, and she frequently heard the other couple arguing. Although she said it really sounded like Einhorn was doing the majority of the yelling, and she is quite sure she heard him hit Holly once or twice. So Judy did what she thought was right. She ended up getting an opportunity to get Holly alone and talked to her about the fact that she probably leave Ira. He clearly was not very nice to her. Lee said that she felt stuck. She didn't really want to be in the relationship with Ira anymore either. She felt as though she could not leave him. By early 1974, the enigmatically beautiful, fiercely independent Holly Maddox had been all but completely broken by the boisterous guru, reduced to not much more than Ira's emotional punching bag, and apparently actual physical punching bag. And to make matters worse, she was pregnant. Holly had terminated a pregnancy 5 years earlier, and she still had mixed emotions about that. She had grown up a good Christian girl, and it really didn't jive with her values to terminate. But at the time, she felt as though she had to. And despite the fact that she had expressed to Ira before that she thought she might like to have a child with him at some point, he went ahead and scheduled an appointment to terminate this one as well. Now, we don't know if that was because Ira pushed her to, or because she just didn't want a child, or maybe she just didn't want a child with Ira after all. We'll unfortunately never know her mind on this, but the point was it was done, and shortly afterwards, the couple began to discuss breaking up yet again. Ira wrote in his journal around that time that he hoped Holly would leave, that she would go and find something better. But of course, like all narcissists, he didn't really mean it. Of course, he didn't want her to go. He wanted her to stay around. He needed somebody to abuse. They did end up breaking up after all, and that summer traveled together to Nova Scotia. They rented a fairly large farmhouse while they were there, and they got to know some of the townspeople, like you do when you go on some extended vacation. Not that I know what that's like. Now, most of them thought that Ira was pretty strange, but they all liked Holly, as everyone did, and the two managed to get along fairly well on this getaway. Although, when a neighbor who Holly had befriended suddenly broke down and asked, "What exactly is it that Ira does?" Holly told them, truthfully, that he was a good manipulator. She left it at that. The following summer, they had separated yet again. Ira went to Europe for the summer, and Holly went to California. And That time away from Ira was great for Holly. She spent a lot of time self reflecting and sort of soul searching, as it were. When she was away from Ira, really seemed to come in her own and be more self assured and more positive about herself and her life. Ira spent a lot of time just sort of pining over the fact that Holly wasn't with him, even though right before he had left, he had insulted her, telling her that he couldn't wait to get away from her so he could find himself a real woman. He also found out that he had a son that was previously unknown to him. When he spoke to Holly to tell her this news, he kind of used this new position of fatherhood as leverage to convince her that he was a totally changed person. He had an all new perspective on life now that he was a father. Was really hurt by this at first. She remembered the child that they might have had together and that she gave up partially for Ira. But in time, she came around and she was convinced that not only was she stronger now, but Ira was going to be different. She agreed that the two of them should get back together, and she just knew that this time he was going to treat her like an equal. So at the end of July, they were back together. As a surprise to absolutely no one, by September, they were on the outs again. Polly had developed bulimia, probably as a result of her complete lack of control over her entire life, and she felt more trapped than she ever had. Of course, Ira continued to mentally torture her. He constantly told her that the reason that they were having problems and the reason he was so unhappy with her and the reason he was so angry was because she refused to work on herself, that she had mental problems and she would not fix it. And that is why they were struggling. Again, nothing is ever Ira's fault. Unfortunately, like so many victims of DV, Holly was so broken down by Ira that she really began to believe these things. She thought that he had somehow attained a higher level of consciousness and understanding that she was too weak or stupid to be able to do. And she believed his assessment that she was dragging him down. And Ira honestly believed that as well. Obviously, it was Ira's abuse and control and manipulation that was dragging Holly down. You and I can see that. But at the time, Holly could not. In the spring of 1976, Holly enrolled in a peer counseling group for women that was run by Penny and Jane Child. She told Penny that her goals in the group were to become strong inside and to leave her boyfriend. In these sessions, she was extremely candid with her peer counselors, telling them Ira was encouraging her to do things in the bedroom that she really wasn't very comfortable with. He also frequently told her that there was no way that she could ever make it without him. And finally, in the ninth week of class, she showed up with a bruised face. She admitted that Ira had hit her. During that period, Holly was splitting her time between Ira's apartment and a commune that was not very far from the Race Street address. She would spend a few days at the commune, go back to Ira's for a little bit, come back to the commune. And the other members of the group could not help but notice how frequently Holly was coming back with clear signs that Ira had gotten physical with her, including on at least one occasion, big black eye. But Holly was trying. She was trying to break away from him. Eventually, she found her own apartment outside of the commune. And this time, she actually moved her belongings out of Race Street and into her new place. But the more she tried to get free of Ira, the more controlling and jealous he would to prove her fidelity. Even though, mind you, they weren't even together at this point, and he was sleeping with multiple other women. He continued to refuse, and eventually he did relent and go home. But once he got home, he called her and he kept blowing up her phone and wearing her down and insisting that the only thing that would get him to stop and to leave her alone was if she agreed to come back to his apartment to spend the night. As she had so many other times before, Holly gave in to his demands. Holly, it seemed, could never break totally free from the master manipulator. That summer, when Ira traveled back to Nova Scotia, Holly went with him. They stayed in the same farmhouse that they had a couple summers before. The place where things between them had been not good exactly, but at least placid. Unfortunately, the hope for another peaceful reconciliation between the two would not come to fruition. Their fights were worse than ever before. Now, to hear Ira tell the story, he was sweet as pie, on his absolute best behavior, and Holly was a wild woman, just flying off the handle and taking issue with his most innocuous words. I don't believe a word of this. When a person has been broken down for so long, they reach a point where they just boil over. And I'm sure that Ira didn't think he was doing anything wrong, so never thought he ever did anything wrong. And I'm sure that Holly did take issue with him constantly. And that is because of his constant and unrelenting criticism and manipulation. Holly cut the trip short. She left him in Canada and traveled back to Tyler, Texas. Holly spent the rest of that summer visiting with her old friends in Tyler, including her old best friend, Tony. She took a cross country trip with her mother and her sister, but by August, Ira's pleading letters to her had worn her down once again, and she agreed that she would join him once again in Nova Scotia. I do think it's important to note Ira's motivations here because in his journals, we see that he was often feeling lonely in Canada. He was in a remote area, so he didn't have as much access to women to outlet his burgeoning carnal desires. He blamed Holly for his loneliness. He blamed her for the fact that he wasn't having enough sex and was having to take care of himself, so to speak. So, did Ira really love Holly? I think that he thought he did, but I don't think he's probably capable of feeling real love for another person. Real love means you have a willingness to consider someone else above yourself, to sacrifice a little bit on behalf of someone else, to be a little selfless. And if that relationship is healthy, the other person is doing those things for you as well. Ira didn't really love Holly. He loved what she could provide to him, either through her own generosity of spirit or through the manipulation that he knew he could subject her to. For the next year, they were on again, off again, as they always had been. Ira continued to see other women, which Holly hated, and Ira continued to encourage Holly to see other men and then turn jealous and rageful when he did. Slowly, though, despite Ira, the now nearly 30-year-old Texan was becoming to come into herself a little bit more. She cut her hair short, even though Ira disapproved of that, and she began to tell him off, not in the hurt and reactionary way that she used to, but just in a cool, matter of fact way. She was no longer pretending with him, but instead being very direct about when he hurt her feelings or when her needs were not being met. When she disapproved of something that he did, she let him know. It seemed for maybe the very first time that she was starting to see herself not as a sheepish attache to Ira's grand being, but as a whole person, his spiritual and emotional equal. Also, around this time, Holly came into some family money, something like $40,000, which here in 2023 is like a month's worth of groceries. But back in 1976, that was like buying a house money. That was a good chunk of change. Holly had been working for almost nothing at a little co-op and living on food that means because I have no idea. But I think it gives some good insight into the kind of very cerebral, but completely unhinged stuff that Ira was devoting his supposedly great brain to. His absolute obsession with all things pseudoscience began to bleed over into his relationships with some of these high ranking executive business owners and other community leaders that he had so carefully developed over the years. Till that point, they had all seen him as kind of wacky, but not terribly out of step with the general vibe of his generation. And although some of them were still kind of amused by his ramblings, others started to really pull away and rely on him less. They just no longer thought that hitching their wagon to that horse was going to be beneficial for their businesses any longer. And the loss of some of those business relationships probably left Ira feeling more rejected than the multiple times that Holly had ditched him. But as always, nothing was ever Ira's fault. Just like he was with everyone who wrote him off, he did not see this as being his problem. If people did not want to be involved with him, it was because they were too stupid and short sighted to see what he was talking about. He was a genius, and he didn't really want them around anymore anyway. As a matter of fact, when he really thinks about it, it was really him that rejected them because those relationships were no longer benefiting him, right? We all know the story of the narcissist. Absolve yourself of responsibility and then shift the blame onto someone else. And I just want to drop in here because I do throw around this word narcissism, narcissist a lot. I am not a mental health professional. When I am using this word, I am saying it in the colloquial layman's way. I am not in any way suggesting that he meets a clinical definition of narcissistic personality disorder. I am not qualified to make that determination. And by the way, if I were a qualified diagnostician, I absolutely could not diagnose someone who had never been my patient. I'm not aware that anyone ever has diagnosed Einhorn, because I will do that sometimes. If someone did receive a diagnosis from a mental health professional, I will mention that. I am not aware that Einhorn ever was. Sorry if this is an over explanation, but I just want to make sure we're very clear that I'm just using that in a layman's way to describe this kind of controlling and selfish behavior. In the spring of 1977, Holly joined Ira on a tour of Europe. Now, no one who knew the couple could really figure out how Holly ended up on this trip. Ira had already told people that he suspected that he and Holly would spend the summer apart, which they often did. Most people assumed that Ira would much prefer to explore the continent, especially the women there, without Holly's constant judgment. However, Holly's bank statements from that time showing thousands of dollars withdrawn for airfare and traveler's checks, I think gives us a little insight as to how she ended up on this excursion. Ira never was one to look a gift horse in the mouth. So a lot of stuff happened on this trip. I won't go into the nitty gritty of it. It's mostly more of the same relationship dynamic. I will condense it and just say this. Charlie nearly went home on multiple occasions, and observers of the couple described the relationship as paternalistic and domineering. That's what you want to hear. Sounds really healthy. Towards the end of that trip, Holly wrote to her family to let them know that for the first time in 5 years, she was making some of her own friends separate from Ira. She had sent him off on an excursion to the English countryside while she stayed in London. While he was on that trip, he met, wooed, and enjoyed the company of at least one other woman. But when he returned back to London to find that Holly had enjoyed that same freedom while they were separated, he was completely irate. Typical. They mutually agreed at that time to end the relationship, and that when they got back to Philadelphia, they would begin to live separately. Ira seemed rather melancholy and brooding about this split, but Molly didn't. She was enthusiastic. She seemed hopeful for the future and for a life without Ira. They parted ways on July 28th. The Unicorn headed to Scandinavia, and Holly went to Fire Island, and then Ira tried one last time to convince Holly not to move out of his apartment. This time, Holly really stuck to her guns. She was ready to reclaim her independence. And it seemed like she really meant it this time. She sent her parents a letter from Fire Island in late August, giving them the new address of where she was going to be staying when she got back to Philly, and letting them know that this time Ira would not be living with her. They were absolutely thrilled. However, that was the last correspondence that the Maddoxes would have from their eldest daughter. Uncharacteristically, they didn't hear from her for the entire month of September. And then when October and Liz Maddox's birthday came and they still had not heard a word, they really started to worry. Liz was so worried, in fact, that she decided to reach out to Ira, a person who she did not really want to speak to. Ira told the Maddoxes that Holly had come back for a few days in September, and then she took off, and he had no idea where she was. End of conversation. The month marched on, and still no one had seen or heard from Holly. By October 20th, Liz decided she needed to call Ira back. This time, she had a list of specific questions. When did Holly leave? Did she have any money with her? Did she take anything with her when she left? Ira's answers were brief, but according to Mrs. Maddox, he did seem concerned. He said Holly had left 2 or 3 weeks previous. She said she would. Previous, she said she was going out to the store and she never returned. He called everyone they knew, and the police and the hospitals, to absolutely no avail. He called their mutual friend who they had stayed with in London, a woman named Joyce. And Joyce, he said, told her not to expect to hear from Holly for 3 or 4 months, but Howard wasn't sure if that meant that Joyce knew where Holly was or not. He told Mrs. Maddox that he thought Holly only had a few dollars with her, and it doesn't seem that she took anything from the apartment. Now, at this time, Holly's old friend Tony, who we've talked about before, was working at the Tyler courthouse and just happened to have a few contacts with the local FBI office. So, Holly's parents asked Tony if she would reach out to them and see if there's anything that they could do to help find their missing daughter. The FBI, unfortunately, told them that missing persons were outside of their jurisdiction and there's really nothing that they could do. So the next person they went to was an old friend of Holly's named Lawrence Wells, who by that time was an assistant U.S. district attorney. He reached out to hospitals and morgues in Philadelphia. He reported her missing to the local Philadelphia authorities, and he even alerted Interpol because she was known to travel and had lots of friends all around the world. Fortunately, Wells didn't even stop there. He was very thorough. He contacted Detective Dennis Lane at the Philadelphia PD to let him know about this missing friend of his. And although a missing 30-year-old woman who was known to live a somewhat transient lifestyle normally would not be at the top of the police's radar because of Wells's influence, they took it pretty seriously. Lane also talked to Holly's doctor, who expressed that he was very concerned about his young patient. She was a diabetic, and he said that summer she had written him a letter explaining to him how she had cured her own diabetes, and then he had not heard from her since. Holly's therapist similarly disclosed that she had not heard from or seen Holly. And I know what you're thinking. Okay, but there was no HIPAA back then, so they were not breaking any privacy laws by telling Detective Lane that they hadn't heard from Holly. Detective Lane also found that Holly's bank account still had about $21,000 remaining in it that had been untouched since the last time she had been seen. At last, the detective decided to drop by Race Street to talk to the unicorn himself, Philadelphia's own hippie king, Mr. Ira Einhorn. He told Lane basically the same story he had told Liz Maddox and Lawrence Wells. She came to visit him in early September. She hadn't moved into her new place yet, which was lucky because, as he said to the detective, they planned to get back together. Weird that she'd been so adamant to her family that she was not going to get back together with him, but whatever. And then around September 12th, she said she was going out to the store. She left, and he never saw her again. He did, however, add some detail to the story that he hadn't previously told anybody. He said that about a week after she went missing, she called him and said that she was okay. She would call him once a week and not to try to find her. He then said